formulated a concept of holy war, jihad, calling on Muslims to subjugate non-Muslims through warfare. Therefore, between AD 633 and 715, Arab armies conquered some two-thirds of the Christian world, including Mesopotamia, Syria, the Holy Land, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain. Through the 8th and 11th centuries, Christians and Muslims continued to fight each other. The Christians attempted to beat the Muslims back and reconquer territory that had been lost. Most of the fighting took place in border regions between the Christian and Muslim worlds, especially Spain, Italy, and what is now called Turkey, but was at the time a Christian region known as Anatolia, ruled by the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine Empire. In the 10th century, a warlike people known as the Seljuk Turks converted to Islam and took power in the Muslim world. The Byzantines were defeated by the Turks in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert, losing almost all of Anatolia. In 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus sent messengers to Pope Urban II in Rome, requesting military aid from the West. Pope Urban gave a speech at the Council of Clermont, where he called on the knights of Europe to unite and march east to help the Byzantines. Christians had fought wars against Muslims before, but Pope Urban declared that anyone who fought in this war would be partaking in a sacred act and win remission from guilt associated with sin, that is to say, earn an indulgence. Pope Urban also emphasized the sacredness of Jerusalem, where Christ had walked, died, and rose. The Pope taught that, by purging Jerusalem of Muslim rulers, the Christians would be performing a holy act in God's eyes. Essentially, the Pope envisioned crusaders as a new type of pilgrim, warrior pilgrims. The tradition of pilgrimage to the holy places in the East had long been a staple of life for medieval Europeans. Therefore, when the Pope suggested to European knights that they should conquer the holy city of Jerusalem and capture it for their own rule, this resonated with them deeply. Huge numbers of knights and common people organized and set out for the East. Several great lords at the time combined their armies for this mission, including Godfrey Bouillon, Raymond IV of Toulouse, and Bohemond. This was the First Crusade that ever occurred, and is now known as the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099. It was very successful, conquering and organizing several new Crusader states in Syria and Palestine. The most important of these states was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, with its capital in the Holy City of Jerusalem. Over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, Christians would continue to fight crusades against the Muslims in the Holy Land, with Jerusalem changing hands several times. During this same period, the popes would call many crusades in Spain and Portugal against the Muslim occupiers in those regions. Gradually, the Crusaders drove the Muslims out of the whole of the Iberian Peninsula. Also, the popes sanctioned crusades in the Baltic against the pagan people who dwelt in those territories, the Northern Crusades. While the Crusades in Spain and the Baltic succeeded, the campaigns in the Holy Land eventually began to fail, with the Muslims driving the Crusaders out of Syria and Palestine completely in 1291. In the 14th century, the Ottoman Turks came to power in the Islamic world and eventually grew to be the greatest power in Islamic history. Having driven the Christians out of the Holy Land, the Muslims conquered Constantinople and drove into Eastern Europe. During the early modern era, crusades were no longer about conquering the Holy Land, but trying to stop the powerful Ottomans from conquering Europe. The popes called crusades against the Ottoman advance, but many failed. The Ottoman Empire continued to grow, swallowing Christian Greece, Crimea, Wallachia, Hungary, Moldavia, and threatening to capture Austria and Italy. Conversely, the Crusades in Spain continued to go well, with Queen Isabel and King Fernando destroying the last Islamic hold in Granada in 1492. In the late 16th century, the tide began to turn again. European powers formed holy leagues, sanctioned with papal crusades. The Ottomans were defeated by a holy league at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, and another holy league defeated the Ottomans decisively in 1683 at the Battle of Vienna, and 1697 at the Battle of Zenta. To recap, the era of crusading began in 1095 with the First Crusade, and continued roughly into the 17th century. A crusade had several defining characteristics, which distinguished it from another military expedition. 1. It was called by a pope. 2. Participants in a crusade earned an indulgence, remission of punishment associated with sins. And 3, a crusade was fought either to hold a sacred site or to expand or defend Christian borders. The First Crusade began to depart for the East in August 1096, with the blessing of Pope Urban II. Among the great lords marching at the heads of their armies was Godfrey of Bouillon, the powerful Duke of Lower Lorraine, driven by his deep piety to rescue Jerusalem. Bohemond, a giant red-headed Norman, left southern Italy with a small but experienced force. The wealthiest man to take the cross was Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, richer than the King of France, and leader of a vast host of southern French knights. The Crusaders converged on Constantinople, where they swore an oath to Alexius Comnenus to return any lands they captured from the Muslims to his empire. In exchange, the Crusaders were to receive military and provisional support from the Byzantines. Accompanied by a small Byzantine detachment under the general Tatikios, the Crusaders crossed the Bosporus into Asia Minor, where, in 1097, they besieged Turkish-occupied Nicaea, the city from whence was born the famous creed of the Christian faith. After defeating a Turkish relief force led by Kili Arslan, the Crusaders attacked the city with mangonels and a siege tower built by Count Raymond. A month later, the Turks surrendered, and Byzantine flags flew once more over Nicaea's walls. The Crusaders continued eastward, across the desolate plains of Asia Minor, hampered by the brutal heat of the sun. Bohemond's army marched ahead of Godfrey's and Raymond's, and by July, the Norman host had reached the ruins of Dorylaeum. Suddenly, Kili Arslan, who had been tracking Bohemond, attacked the Normans with his swift Turkish mounted archers. At first, the Crusaders suffered serious losses, but Bohemond ordered his men to dismount and form a protective encirclement around their horses and baggage. As a result, the light Turkish cavalry could no longer do them much damage. Suddenly, the armies of Raymond and Godfrey appeared and charged, crushing and scattering the Turks. The Crusaders now entered Syria and marched south. By October, they'd arrived before Antioch, the largest city in the Mediterranean world at that time, aside from Constantinople. Part of Antioch's walls hugged the treacherous Mount Silpius, and the sheer size of the city made it impossible for the army to fully surround it. Although they'd hoped to move on to Jerusalem in a few weeks, the Crusaders were detained by the siege through the winter, which brought hunger to the Latin camp. By the opening months of 1098, the Crusaders were no closer to entering Antioch, and desertions became rampant. Tatikios withdrew the Byzantine contingent, promising to return with reinforcements. By May, still no Byzantine army had arrived, but news reached the Crusaders that Kerbuga, a powerful Turkish emir from Baghdad, was on his way with a massive army ready to crush the Christian besiegers. It was at this point that Bohemond, who spoke fluent Greek, established contact with an Armenian guard named Firuz. On one of the towers on Antioch's walls, Firuz agreed to betray his tower to Bohemond. On the night of June 2nd, Bohemond moved a force before Firuz's tower under cover of darkness. Quickly seizing control of that section of the wall, Bohemond threw open a city gate to the army. The Crusaders poured into Antioch, slaughtering every Muslim they could find. By morning, they controlled the city. Only 2 days later, Kerbuga's host arrived and surrounded the city. Antioch was depleted of supplies. The Crusaders now faced starvation due to Kerbuga's blockade. However, on June 15, Peter Bartholomew, a priest in the following of Raymond of Toulouse, discovered in the Cathedral of St. Peter what he believed to be the holy lance that had pierced the side of Christ. This restored the confidence of the army. On June 28th, the Crusaders emerged from the city in battle formation. Bohemond led a cavalry charge that smashed a crucial portion of Kerbuga's troops. The Muslim army broke and fled. The Crusaders had triumphed. With Antioch secure, the bulk of the army was eager to move on to Jerusalem, but there was controversy over the fate of the city. Count Raymond insisted it be handed over to Emperor Alexius, but Bohemond pointed out that the Byzantines had abandoned them, and urged the Crusaders to put Antioch under his own control. Finally, in January 1099, the Crusaders set out south down the Syrian coastline toward Jerusalem, under the command of Count Raymond, leaving Bohemond in control of Antioch with a Norman garrison. By June 7, the Crusaders arrived at Jerusalem, now accompanied by the army of Godfrey of Bouillon. The city was under the control of Fatimid Egypt, and the Egyptian garrison had stockpiled the city for a long siege. The Crusaders made a couple of failed assaults, but managed to build several siege machines using timber from Genoese ships that had arrived at the port of Jaffa. Finally, on July 15th, the Crusaders broke through the walls. Godfrey of Bouillon and a group of his knights were the first to enter the city. Many of the city's Muslims were put to the sword. The Fatimid garrison commanders took refuge in the Tower of David, where they received a safe conduct from Count Raymond, whose troops escorted them safely out of the city. The armies of Godfrey and Raymond next marched south on the Egyptian fortress of Ascalon, where they defeated a Fatimid relieving force intent on contesting the Christian capture of Jerusalem. The crusade had triumphed. The army thanked God at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which contained the tomb of Christ. Godfrey of Bouillon was elected first ruler of the newly established Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, but he refused to take the title king in a city where Christ had been crucified, preferring instead to be called defender of the Holy Sepulchre. After the fall of Edessa to the Turkish emir Zengi in 1144, news spread in Europe that the Crusader states had lost an important city. In 1145, Pope Eugenius III issued the bull Quantum Predecessoris, calling the Knights of the West to imitate the First Crusade and march on the Holy Land to help the Latin East. By now, Europe's nobles had grown up with stories of the First Crusade. Knights felt eager to emulate legends like Bohemond and Godfrey of Bouillon. Crusade enthusiasm was bolstered by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, whom the Pope put in charge of disseminating the call to the cross. Bernard, famed for his holiness and learning, electrified crowds with eloquent speeches urging men to crusade. Louis VII, King of France, assembled the French nobility and publicly took the cross from Bernard himself. So many knights followed this example that Bernard ran out of cloth crosses to pin to their coats. In Germany, too, King Conrad III was moved to tears when he heard Bernard preach. Conrad and a whole host of his vassals committed themselves to march east. Conrad and his army departed May 1147. Their march took them through the Byzantine Empire. When Conrad's army arrived in Constantinople, Louis and the French were still a ways behind. Conrad should have waited for Louis, but instead he crossed the Bosporus ahead of him. The Germans marched across scorching central Anatolia. Like the First Crusade, they encountered a Turkish army at Dorylaeum, but Conrad was no Bohemond and arranged his forces too loosely. The Germans were beaten, the bulk of the army lost. With his remaining troops, Conrad retreated to Nicaea to await the French. When Louis arrived at Nicaea, he was alarmed to see the German host so reduced. Louis and Conrad decided to march along the coast this time, heading east towards Syria. The Crusaders were harassed constantly by Turkish attack. Like Conrad, Louis wasn't much of a general, but the French fared better than the Germans, the army surviving, even as it suffered heavy losses. The French managed to hurl back the Turks at Ephesus on Christmas Eve, and again in a major engagement at the Meander Ford. By the time the army reached Adalia, it was remarkable that the French army still existed at all, considering that they were enormously outnumbered by the local Turkish forces, who knew the territory intimately and used it to their advantage. Louis decided that the risk of crossing the mountains north of Antioch was too great. He attempted to contract Italian ships for the remainder of the journey, but his army was too large. Therefore, Louis made the stunning decision to board a boat himself along with his wife, Queen Eleanor, and his household, leaving the remainder of the army to continue the march on land. The French were deeply demoralized and continued on without their king. A contingent of Knights Templar sent from Outremer to aid the passage of the French greatly bolstered the Crusaders in this desperate hour, and without their guidance, perhaps none of Louis's troops would have made it to Syria. Meanwhile, Zengi was stabbed to death in his own bath by a Frankish slave. Zengi's son, Nur ad-Din, took power in Aleppo. He ordered the slaughter of every Christian man, woman, and child in Edessa, then razed the city to the ground, so that the Crusaders could not retake it. Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch, eagerly anticipated the great German and French armies. He was disturbed when he was instead confronted with the battered remnants of the Crusader forces trickling into Antioch, and Louis himself arriving separately. With Edessa destroyed, Raymond urged Louis to put his troops toward an attack on Aleppo. Zengi's heirs were divided, with his son Saif ad-Din holding Mosul and Nur ad-Din controlling Aleppo. But since Louis's arrival in Antioch, more Crusaders had shown up to the south in the ports of Acre and Tyre in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Also Conrad, who had returned to Constantinople because of illness, had gone on to Acre. Thus Louis chose to combine his forces with those mustering in the south. The later tales of Louis dismissing Raymond's proposal because of a sexual affair going on between the Prince of Antioch and Queen Eleanor are unconfirmed, and likely little more than gossip. After Louis visited the Holy Sepulchre, a war council convened June 24th, 1148 in Acre. The Patriarch of Jerusalem and the Templars favored an assault on Damascus. After much debate, Louis and Conrad agreed. The French and German forces joined with the army of Jerusalem and the Templars, besieging Damascus on July 24. The strategy hinged on a rapid assault of the city, which, without a relieving army, would be forced to surrender quickly. The Crusaders' plan relied on Nur ad-Din and Saif ad-Din being too occupied with mutual hostilities to intervene, but Zengi's sons had made a temporary truce and moved south with their joint armies, intent on preventing a Frankish takeover of Damascus. With the approach of so large a relieving force, the Crusaders recognized that their position was untenable. They withdrew on July 28th, only 4 days into the siege. Louis and Conrad returned home, while Jerusalem renewed her peace treaty with Damascus in 1149. News of the failure spread shock and sorrow all across Europe. Bernard of Clairvaux was devastated. Bernard, confident that God would manifest a victory, had pitched the crusade as a guaranteed success. Bernard's reputation for holiness survived, but he did receive considerable criticism across Europe for the failure of this enterprise, which he had endorsed so wholeheartedly. Both Louis and Conrad had proved to be poor generals, their lack of coordination with one another and poor arrangement of forces leading to the crucial losses in Anatolia. The First Crusade had benefited from the strategic brilliance of Bohemond of Taranto, whose generalship had allowed the Crusaders to triumph repeatedly over the numerically superior Turks. But unfortunately, neither Louis nor Conrad had turned out to be a Bohemond. In 1187, Jerusalem, Acre, Jaffa, and nearly the whole of the Crusader kingdom save Tyre fell to Saladin. News of this sent shockwaves through Christendom. Pope Gregory VIII issued a crusade bull calling the Knights of Europe to aid the Christians in the East by defeating Saladin. Richard the Lionheart, crowned King of England in 1189, vowed to lead an army to the Holy Land. King Philip II of France also took the cross. The army Richard raised was better supplied and larger than Philip's contingent. Well-spoken, well-educated, tall, physically powerful, and an accomplished general, warrior, and poet, Richard epitomized the chivalric ideal. Philip and Richard transported their armies by sea. Philip arrived at the port city Acre ahead of Richard on April 10, 1191, where a Crusader army led by Guy of Lusignan was already besieging the city. Saladin himself besieged the besiegers, harassing them with his forces camped behind them. Meanwhile, a storm disrupted Richard's fleet, and a few ships wrecked on the island of Cyprus. Cyprus, lying just west of the Syrian coast, was currently ruled by Isaac Comnenus, an ally to Saladin. Isaac sent troops to plunder Richard's ships. When Richard arrived with the main fleet, he landed his army and immediately attacked Isaac, his superior knights making quick work of Isaac's men. By May, Richard had conquered the whole of the island, and Isaac was in chains. Richard used Cyprus as a supply source throughout the crusade. Richard arrived at Acre with much fanfare, his galleys sinking a Muslim supply ship bound for the city. The Crusaders attacked Acre with renewed vigor, Richard bombarding the walls with siege engines. On July 12th, the Muslim garrison asked for terms. Richard and Philip promised to release the men who had defended Acre in exchange for 200,000 dinars, though Saladin asked for time to raise funds. While the Crusaders settled into Acre, the deadline for Saladin's payment arrived, but the Sultan asked for more time. Richard agreed. Yet when the next deadline passed, Saladin still stalled. Richard, perceiving that Saladin was more interested in delaying the crusade than redeeming his troops, called Saladin's bluff and executed the Muslim prisoners on August 20th. With Acre back in Christian hands, King Philip considered his vow fulfilled. Against Richard's objections, King Philip returned to France, though he left the bulk of the French army behind. Now Richard alone commanded the crusade. He determined next to take Jaffa and march south along the coast. Richard arranged his forces with infantry and crossbowmen in close order with the cavalry, while supply ships shadowed them by sea. All through the march, Saladin's forces followed, harassing the Crusaders, but Richard's formation was unbreakable. Saladin, desperate to halt the Christian advance, selected a wooded area just north of Arsuf for an all-out assault. Richard was expecting this and organized his troops for battle. As the Christians emerged from the woods on September 7th, the Muslims struck, but Richard led his men in a sweeping cavalry charge that crushed Saladin's lines. After a few more charges, some 7,000 Muslims lay dead on the field, with the rest of the army fleeing. The Crusaders' victory at Arsuf shattered Saladin's reputation as a victorious conqueror. Richard took control of Arsuf and continued on to occupy Jaffa. With Jaffa once more Christian, Richard began a series of strategic raids around the coastal plain, retaking the local castles and establishing control of the region. At the same time, he sent envoys to Saladin to discuss the possibility of peace. By January 1192, Richard called council to discuss an assault on Jerusalem. The Templars and Hospitallers argued against attacking the city, since it lay inland and would be difficult to defend once Richard's army departed. Richard took seriously the opinion of these warrior monks, with their long years fighting in the Holy Land. He decided to move instead on Ascalon to the south, from which he could harass Saladin's supply lines from Egypt. At Ascalon, Richard faced pressure from the army to move on Jerusalem, but by now he was set against the idea. Richard was convinced that while he could effectively control the coastal territories, moving his army too far inland would put it in an unfavorable position. On June 20th, Richard's forces intercepted and captured an enormous Muslim caravan loaded with supplies en route to Saladin's camp at Jerusalem. Saladin, humiliated by repeated defeats, attacked Jaffa on July 27, capturing all but the city's citadel. Saladin promised the garrison in the citadel that he would spare Jaffa's citizens if they would surrender, but Saladin was unable to control his troops, who sacked the city. Meanwhile, Richard, having heard about what was transpiring at Jaffa, rushed to the city's defense. As his galleys put in on the beach, Richard himself charged ashore with a handful of knights and fell upon Saladin's men. Richard and his crusaders cut their way through Jaffa's narrow streets, purging it of Muslim troops. On August 5th, Saladin tried to dislodge Richard from the city. Richard was ready, having drawn up his little army in formation before Jaffa. Although the Crusaders were heavily outnumbered, Richard and his knights quickly cut down Saladin's advance guard. The rest of the Muslim troops, amazingly, just stood there, terrified to make a move against the King of England. In mockery of Saladin's impotence, Richard himself rode up and down the Muslim lines, his lance raised, daring the Muslims to attack him. They would not. Richard's victory at Jaffa would be the final act of the Third Crusade. On September 2nd, Richard and Saladin concluded the Treaty of Ramla, which recognized the Crusader territories stretching along the coast from Jaffa to Acre to Tyre, as well as the island of Cyprus, and a 3-year peace with Saladin's kingdom. Saladin also agreed to allow unarmed Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem, Both sides agreed that Ascalon would be demolished. Historian Thomas Madden says that the Third Crusade was, by almost any measure, a highly successful expedition. Most of Saladin's victories in the wake of Hattin were wiped away. The Crusader kingdom was healed of its divisions, restored to its coastal cities, and secured in a peace with its greatest enemy. Andrew Ehrenkreutz, author of the book Saladin, further explains, in spite of overwhelming odds in their favor, the Muslims could neither outfight the Christian contingent, nor simultaneously protect Ascalon and Jerusalem. Considering the military organization and defense-oriented economy of the Muslim countries, and in view of the strategic advantages they secured in 1187 through 89, the terms of the 1192 armistice must be regarded as a humiliating concession the Christian invaders imposed on Islam. In 1198, Pope Innocent III, eager to restore Jerusalem to Christian rule, proclaimed a new crusade. Count Louis of Blois and many French knights took the cross. In 1200, the illustrious Count Baldwin IX of Flanders also vowed to lead a force to the east, as did Boniface of Montferrat. These lords adopted Richard the Lionheart's plan of conquering Egypt as a means toward securing Jerusalem. The lords sent envoys to meet with Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, to contract ships to transport their armies to Egypt, estimating that the crusade would number around 26,500 men. The envoys contracted Venice for 50 ships. The Venetians stopped all other commercial activity and devoted their full efforts toward constructing the fleet. But since no king commanded the crusade, many knights did not feel obliged to depart from Venice and left by other ports. The army that actually assembled at Venice numbered around 12,000. The Crusade's leaders were in the awkward position of needing only a third of the galleys commissioned, and having no means to pay for the rest. Enrico Dandolo asked the Crusaders to recoup Venice's loss by conquering Zara, a city on the Dalmatian coast formerly under Venetian power. The Crusade's leaders were disturbed by this offer, since Zara was a Christian city, and yet it was a tempting means of erasing their debt. The Doge argued that his claim to Zara was lawful. Louis, Baldwin, and Boniface allowed themselves to be convinced and agreed to subdue Zara, though the decision spread dissent throughout the army. Many knights, including Simon of Montfort, argued that this was a violation of their sacred vows. After a week-long siege, Zara fell and was returned to Venetian rule. Hearing of this, Pope Innocent III excommunicated the entire Crusader army. The French lords sent envoys to the Pope, begging his forgiveness. After the French made a repentance, Innocent lifted the excommunication, but maintained his condemnation of Venice. But Boniface of Montferrat intercepted the papal envoys carrying Innocent's reproof of the Venetians. While still at Zara, the Crusaders received emissaries from Alexius Angelus, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelus. Alexius was currently staying at the court of Philip of Swabia, but his envoys explained to the Crusaders that he was the rightful Byzantine emperor, though the throne was currently held by an usurper who had blinded and imprisoned Isaac. The envoys asked the Crusaders to restore Alexius to Constantinople's throne. If they did, Alexius would join their crusade, add the Byzantine army to their ranks, and provide lucrative funds from the Byzantine treasury. The Crusade's leaders were intrigued. Byzantine participation would be a great asset to their war against Egypt. The idea of a diversion to Constantinople reawakened controversy in the army. Simon of Montfort was the loudest critic, and the majority of the rank-and-file soldiers, eager to fight the Muslims, agreed with him. Nevertheless, Count Louis, Count Baldwin, and Boniface of Montferrat signed a treaty with Alexius, agreeing to restore him to Constantinople. Many knights, including Simon of Montfort, abandoned the army, traveling on their own to Outremer. As the Crusaders sailed for Constantinople, they received an angry letter from Pope Innocent, forbidding them to travel to Byzantium. Once again, the Crusades' leaders hid the message from the rank and file. They camped outside of Constantinople's walls. Boniface and the Doge brought Prince Alexius out onto the deck of a Venetian galley, and cruising along the city, displayed him for the people, shouting their good intentions. The citizens on the wall responded with curses, insults, and even arrows. Clearly, Alexius had exaggerated the enthusiasm of Constantinople's citizens for his cause. The diversion to Byzantium had greatly reduced the army's size. To withdraw now would mean the Crusades' collapse. Therefore, the Crusaders decided to attack Constantinople, an all but impossible task, considering their numbers. Nevertheless, in July 1203, the Crusaders began their assault. By August 1st, after fierce fighting, the Crusaders had managed to take control of the city. They raised Prince Alexius to the throne, and he was crowned Emperor Alexius IV. Despite the coronation of Alexius, anti-Western feeling was rampant in Constantinople, and the young emperor did not fully control the city. He failed to deliver the troops or funds he'd promised the Crusaders, who remained camped outside Constantinople's walls. Murtzuphlus, a Greek nobleman, organized an anti-Latin faction and seized control of the city. Murtzuphlus had Alexius IV strangled to death and proclaimed himself emperor, shutting the city gates to the Crusaders. Murtzuphulus's coup inspired new fury in the Crusaders. They determined to retake Constantinople, besieging the city in April 1204. After a few days, Constantinople fell. Murtzuphlus was seized and executed. The Greek clergy approached the Crusades' leaders and begged them to be merciful toward the ancient capital of the Christian East, but their plea fell on deaf ears. The Crusades' leaders permitted their men to sack the Byzantine capital, and for 3 days Constantinople was subject to pillage and vandalism at the hands of the Crusaders. In 1213, Pope Innocent III announced plans for another crusade to the Holy Land. Since his previous crusade had been diverted, Innocent planned the Fifth Crusade as an entirely church-directed affair. Innocent believed that all of Latin Christendom must act together if Jerusalem were to be secured. He expanded the privileges of the Crusader, granting, on top of the traditional plenary indulgence, immunity from all taxes and forgiveness of all debts. Also, anyone who financed a Crusader was to receive the same plenary indulgence as if he himself had crusaded. After Saladin's death, his heirs fought a bitter civil war. Saladin's brother Al-Adil eventually succeeded in disenfranchising Saladin's sons and seizing power over the Ayyubid lands, placing his own son Al-Kamil in charge of Egypt. However, Al-Adil faced constant rebellions and plotted coups. Response to the Pope's appeal was lukewarm in France, where many knights had just fought in the Albigensian Crusade and already earned a plenary indulgence. Crusade enthusiasm was strong among the knights of Hungary. Their king Andrew II took the cross. Austria, too, became a hotbed of cross-taking when Duke Leopold VI announced plans to crusade. Fervor for the Holy Land spread in Italy and Germany. Frederick II, heir to the Holy Roman Empire and crown of Sicily, took the cross. In July 1216, Innocent died, but his successor, Honorius III, was just as committed to the crusade. Not everything went according to the Pope's plan. The young Frederick, embroiled in political problems, delayed his departure. Andrew II and Leopold VI were first to travel east. On October 9, 1217, the Hungarians and Austrians arrived via Venetian ships at Cyprus, where they were joined by the forces of John, King of Acre, and Bohemond IV of Antioch. The Crusader coalition sailed to Acre, where they decided to raid Al-Adil's lands. On November 10th, the Crusaders sparred with Al-Adil's army near Bethsaida on the Jordan. Andrew and Leopold next restored 2 key fortresses on the coastal road, the Templar castle of Athlit and Caesarea. By early 1218, Andrew considered his vow fulfilled and returned home. The exit of the Hungarians was offset by the arrival in the spring of Oliver of Paderborn and his German and Frisian contingents, along with William I, Count of Holland. With their numbers enlarged, the Crusaders decided to begin the assault on Egypt. In May 1218, Crusader fleets massed before Damietta, their first target on the Nile, which would open the way to Cairo. The Crusaders targeted the Chain Tower, a massive fortification situated on an island in the middle of the Nile across from Damietta. A massive chain stretched from the tower to the city, blocking access to Damietta's port. Anyone who held that tower would control what entered and exited Damietta. The scientifically minded Oliver of Paderborn designed a brilliant new siege engine to capture the chain tower. Oliver placed 4 stout masts atop 2 cogs bound together. On top of the masts was a wooden fortress with a rotating scaling ladder, operated by a complex pulley system. On August 24th, a company of crusaders entered Oliver's ingenious vehicle and approached the chained tower. The fighting was fierce, but Oliver's machine worked. The crusaders captured the tower and threw down Al-Adil's standards. Damietta was now cut off from the outside world. Meanwhile, Al-Adil died. As usual, the Ayyubid Empire was once again split into competing factions, now among Al-Adil's sons, with Al-Kamil ruling Egypt. In the Latin camp, the papal legate, Portuguese Cardinal Pelagius of Albano, arrived to assume leadership of the crusade, in accordance with Pope Innocent's original plan. Al-Kamil decided to offer the crusaders a deal: Jerusalem, in exchange for their departure from Egypt. King John favored accepting this offer, but Pelagius refused, unless it also included Kerak and the kingdom of Jerusalem's other former castles east of the Jordan. Al-Kamil refused to include these strategically important sites, and so Pelagius rejected the offer. This angered many of the Crusades' knights, who considered Jerusalem their most important goal. William of Holland withdrew with his knights at once. Pelagius insisted that only the conquest of Egypt would secure Jerusalem. The siege of Damietta wore on through 1219. By November, the Muslim garrison was exhausted beyond resistance, and the Crusaders captured the city. Al-Kamil retreated south upriver to Mansoura to block the way to Cairo. Throughout 1220, there was no fighting, with the Crusaders stalled in Damietta. Meanwhile, in Europe, on November 20th, 1220, Frederick II was finally crowned Holy Roman Emperor and announced that he could at last fulfill his crusading vow. He sent Louis, Duke of Bavaria, ahead with a German army to join the Crusaders at Damietta. Louis found a crusading army living comfortably, but growing restive in the Egyptian port city. Louis had been instructed not to allow an attack on Cairo until the emperor's arrival, but Pelagius favored a march south. Louis and Pelagius compromised with the idea of attacking Mansoura, where Al-Kamil had built a considerable fortress to protect Cairo. In July 1221, a Latin army numbering half the Crusaders' full strength marched out of Damietta and moved south down the Nile. Meanwhile, Al-Kamil's brothers in Syria had finally recognized the danger posed by the Crusaders and united with their brother. A large Ayyubid army assembled at Mansoura. Pelagius ignored King John's advice about positioning the Latin forces. John, who understood the Nile well, knew what locations were vulnerable to flooding. By August, the rising river did threaten the Crusaders. After intense fighting with the Ayyubids, Pelagius realized too late that his position was not tenable. He tried to withdraw the army north back toward Damietta, but by now Al-Kamil had managed to position an army on the Nile to block the Crusaders' way. In this critical moment, King John took control of the army and arranged it solidly enough for a desperate last stand. As usual, the Templars greatly bolstered the Crusaders' tactical integrity, and it's possible that without the Templars' presence, Al-Kamil's troops might have been able to completely break up the Crusaders' position. Al-Kamil's brothers favored a decisive battle with the Latin army, but Al-Kamil wisely saw the problem in this. Even if he did annihilate the Crusaders at Mansoura, half the Latin army remained safely inside of Damietta, which could continue to act as a rallying point for more European Crusaders. Instead, Al-Kamil offered the trapped Latin army generous terms. Surrender Damietta, and the whole of the Christian army could depart with their lives. Pelagius and Louis had no choice but to accept. Indeed, they considered themselves fortunate to be able to save their men. Back in Damietta, more of Frederick's troops had just arrived, horrified to learn that Damietta was about to be returned to the Muslims. There was much anger that the Crusaders had moved south before the arrival of the emperor. Once Al-Kamil had re-established control of Damietta, he struck an 8-year truce with the Crusaders. So ended the Fifth Crusade. In 1225, Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, married Isabella, daughter of John, the King of Frankish Outremer. Thus, Frederick was now poised to add King of Jerusalem to his long list of titles. But it was now 10 years since Frederick had taken the cross, and Pope Honorius III was growing impatient of his delays. Meanwhile, in the Ayyubid kingdom in Egypt and Syria, Saladin's heirs had rent his empire asunder with internal feuding. After the Fifth Crusade, Al-Kamil, Sultan of Egypt, settled into open hostilities with his brother, Al-Muazzam, in Damascus. All this was watched by Frederick II, the supremely gifted politician. He saw in Ayyubid divisions an opportunity. Al-Kamil, keenly aware of Frederick's talents, was convinced that the emperor intended to play Al-Muazzam against him. To stall this possibility, the Sultan of Egypt sent an envoy, Fakhr al-Din, to Frederick's court with lavish gifts to charm the emperor. But Fakhr al-Din was perhaps more charmed by the brilliant Frederick, a highly cultured man who wrote one of the 13th century's most important works on falconry. The two struck up a friendship, discussing philosophy, religion, and science. Fakhr al-Din explained to Frederick that Al-Kamil would surrender Jerusalem if Frederick promised not to lead a crusade to Egypt. When Honorius died in 1227, St. Peter's new heir, Pope Gregory IX, delivered to Frederick an ultimatum: crusade, or be excommunicated. Illness prevented the emperor from departing that year, but the Pope would have no excuse, and made good on his threat in September. Frederick announced that, excommunicated or not, next year he would raise an army and crusade. At the end of June 1228, Frederick's army was ready, and he sailed east. The Pope wrote ahead to Acre, informing the Patriarch Gerald, the Templars, and the Hospitallers that Frederick, as an excommunicant, was not to be aided. When Frederick arrived in Acre, the reception he received was divided. The men of his own territory, Italians, Germans, Normans, and the Teutonic Knights, all pledged themselves to Frederick's cause, though the Templars and Hospitallers shunned him. Immediately, Frederick sent envoys to Al-Kamil, explaining that he would accept the Sultan's offer of Jerusalem. Al-Kamil replied with a stream of diplomats bearing gifts to Frederick, trying to stall for time. In fact, Al-Kamil was occupied in besieging Damascus, which was held by the heirs of his brother Al-Muazzam. Al-Kamil hoped that if he could delay Frederick long enough to subdue Damascus, he would then have the military strength to forcibly expel Frederick's army. In particular, Al-Kamil was concerned about Frederick's fleet, which was a serious threat to Egypt. Of course, Frederick recognized what Al-Kamil intended, and vowed to take Jerusalem before Damascus fell. The Templars and Hospitallers, impressed by this, followed Frederick to Jaffa, where the emperor restored the city's damaged fortifications and prepared his army for an attack on Jerusalem. Well, this got Al-Kamil's attention. The Sultan knew that if Frederick attacked Palestine, he would have to lift the siege of Damascus and divert troops to meet Frederick. Al-Kamil sent envoys to Frederick, offering to surrender to the emperor Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth. Al-Kamil also proposed a 10-year truce with the Crusaders. Frederick accepted, and agreed to allow all Muslim citizens to retain their property in Jerusalem, as well as their holy sites of Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. The Treaty of Jaffa was finalized. Al-Kamil's garrison withdrew from Jerusalem, while Frederick and his army took control of the city. Frederick entered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where he crowned himself King of Jerusalem. The Arab sources imply that Frederick promised Al-Kamil not to restore Jerusalem's defensive fortifications. But historian David Abulafia says, the city's fortifications were gradually restored. Deeply pious, Louis IX, King of France, was devastated by news that Jerusalem had fallen to the Muslims again in 1244, and vowed to lead an army to the holy city's relief. Louis had ample means to accomplish this, for the Kingdom of France had reached a point of considerable wealth. Louis took meticulous care to personally ensure that his crusade was well-financed, well-provisioned, and well-planned. Genoese fleets transported the French forces, and food and supplies were stockpiled on Cyprus in anticipation of the Crusade's arrival. On August 25th, 1248, Louis's fleet sailed, arriving on Cyprus by September. The French king announced that he intended to campaign in Egypt, drawing on the now standard wisdom that the conqueror of Cairo would control Jerusalem. Louis held long sessions with his war council, going over the events of the Fifth Crusade, trying to ensure that his own strategy would avoid its errors. Louis's fleet departed Cyprus in May 1249, arriving at Damietta on June 4. The Sultan of Egypt, As-Salih, positioned an army on the west bank to prevent a French landing. But Louis's galleys were equipped to open on the beach and allow the knights to charge straight onto the land. As-Salih's troops retreated before the heavy French cavalry, while the garrison of Damietta panicked and fled. Thus Louis was able to immediately occupy the city. As-Salih established his forces south of Damietta at Mansoura. Meanwhile, Louis decided to advance on Cairo, and on November 20th, the French began a slow march south down the Nile, establishing bases all along the way to avoid being cut off from Damietta like the Fifth Crusade. Suddenly, As-Salih fell ill and died, while the Sultan's men sent for As-Salih's heir, who was in Syria. The Emir Fakhr al-Din organized opposition to the Crusaders. An Egyptian trader came before Louis to reveal the location of a ford downriver. Louis dispatched Robert of Artois with a detachment to make a surprise attack on Fakhr al-Din's camp before Mansoura. Robert achieved total surprise and destroyed Fakhr al-Din's force, killing the emir himself, but then rashly ordered an assault on Mansoura before Louis could join him with the main body. Mansoura's garrison defeated Robert, by which time Egyptian reinforcements arrived to confront the main Crusader army. In the following battle, Louis's forces suffered a serious defeat that so reduced their numbers that an attack on Cairo was now unthinkable. Illness spread through the French army. The new Sultan, Turan Shah, arrived and managed to cut off the supply lines to Damietta. Louis's crusade was now in exactly the same position as the Fifth Crusade had been at its most desperate hour, but in a far weaker condition. Turan Shah slaughtered the Christian infantry, who would bring no ransom, but captured Louis and his high-ranking knights. Soon after this, the Sultan's own Mamluk officers revolted suddenly and overthrew the Ayyubid regime, stabbing Turan Shah to death. The Mamluks negotiated with the French occupying Damietta. An enormous ransom for the king was raised. On May 6th, Damietta was surrendered to the Mamluks, and the king, along with a good portion of the upper nobility, were released from captivity. The remnants of Louis's army limped on to Acre. The king would remain in the Holy Land for a further 4 years, improving the fortifications of Acre, Caesarea, Jaffa, and Sidon, and acting as de facto ruler of the kingdom. Although his crusade had failed, Louis's presence in Outremer proved incredibly harmonizing, since everyone trusted him. During his brief stay, the usual quarreling factions were united in purpose. Louis established a permanent French garrison at Acre to bolster the city's staff of Templars, Hospitallers, and secular troops. Then finally, in 1254, he returned home. The Mamluk Baybars became Sultan of Egypt in 1260 and embarked on a decade of conquests in the Crusader kingdom, capturing Arsuf, Caesarea, Safad, and Jaffa. At every turn, Baybars slaughtered and enslaved Christians, until 1268, when he conquered Antioch, one of the great capitals of Crusader Outremer, having stood for some 170 years. Baybars' men slaughtered every Christian they could get their hands on, save the pretty women and young boys who lived out their lives in sex slavery. Far away in the Kingdom of France, an aging Louis IX heard reports of the losses in the East, and was much troubled. At an assembly of barons, Louis declared his intentions to lead a new crusade. This time, his council universally opposed the idea. Most of Louis's knights believed his crusading dreams were the ideals of a youth that the king should have long ago set aside. As usual, the king was undeterred, and with the Pope's aid, set about organizing a new crusade. He spared no amount of care and preparation, and if anything, Louis's second crusade was better organized and better funded than his first. This was a reflection of the widespread reforms Louis had cultivated in France, which had allowed his kingdom to rise to new levels of prosperity and efficiency like never before. Louis's brother, Charles of Anjou, who had recently become King of Sicily, was closely involved with the planning, but the two were quite secretive about where they intended to direct the crusade. Most assumed Louis would once again attempt a conquest of Egypt, but just before embarking via a Genoese fleet, Louis assembled his barons and announced that they were headed for Tunis. Everyone was stunned. If Louis intended to cut a path to the Holy Land from Tunis, he certainly had a long war ahead of him. But the destination was a sensible target. Tunis lay on the North African coast directly opposite from Sicily, which was now controlled by Louis's brother. The city was poorly defended, and a siege could be easily supplied from Sicily. Plus, the capture of Tunis would make Louis and his brother the masters of the western Mediterranean. The Crusaders put ashore on Tunisia on July 18, 1270. They quickly captured a Muslim fortress on the site of ancient Carthage, setting up a base there. While Louis and his council prepared their next move, an outbreak of disease spread suddenly through the army's ranks. North African summers are notoriously deadly, especially for foreigners. Many soldiers fell ill, and soon even Louis's own sons, Philip and Jean, took sick. When Jean died, Louis was heartbroken. By August, Louis himself was confined to a sickbed, his condition rapidly deteriorating. It soon became apparent that the king would not recover. On the night of August 24th, after receiving last rites, Louis was heard to call out, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem," as he lay in a feverish sweat. With his men all around him, he died. An unspeakable sorrow fell over the Crusaders. Louis had been deeply loved by his people, and his passing would be mourned all across Europe. Louis's son Philip, the heir to the throne, was still recovering from his illness, and so responsibility of the Crusades' command fell on Charles of Anjou. Charles, who shared little in his brother's Crusader idealism, was eager to be done with the whole affair and get back to his own kingdom. He immediately opened negotiations with the Emir of Tunis, Muhammad I. Muhammad was quite eager to come to terms with Charles, essentially offering to become a vassal to the Kingdom of Sicily. The emir proposed that Sicily receive special trading rights with Tunis, and offered to pay an enormous indemnity of 210,000 gold ounces, to be followed by annual tribute. Muhammad also agreed to allow the free proselytizing of Christianity throughout his emirate, and released Christian captives held in Tunis. Charles found these terms quite acceptable, and by November, the crusade withdrew. Louis's final crusade is in many ways the crusade that never really was. Before any major operations could be undertaken, illness spread through the army, and the king himself died. Charles of Anjou gained more than anyone, with the submission of the Emir Muhammad proving enormously lucrative to the Sicilian crown. The loss of King Louis brought mourning to all of Christendom. Although his crusades had been failures, his reputation for holiness was in no way diminished, with his memory treasured even to this day. For Crusader Outremer, the crusade truly achieved nothing, with the coastal Levantine cities still in peril. However, another crusade was about to put in on the shores of Outremer itself, the Ninth Crusade. The Crusader force led by Edward I, Prince of England, was remarkably small, composed of some 250 knights and 600 infantry. Edward had intended to go to the aid of Louis IX in Tunis, but when news of the French king's death reached him, the prince sailed instead for Acre. The situation in the Holy Land was dire. Croc des Chevaliers, one of the most important hospitaller castles in Outremer, fell to the Sultan Baybars and his Mamluks in April 1271. Edward's ships put into Acre in May, just as Baybars was besieging Tripoli, which was filled with thousands of Christian refugees. A French contingent, led by Charles of Naples, arrived to bolster the English army. Edward immediately led the Christian forces in a counterattack, successfully disrupting the Mamluk supply lines. Baybars was forced to withdraw in defeat, and Tripoli was saved. Edward now sent an embassy to the Mongol conqueror of Persia, Abaga, who despised the Mamluks. On September 4th, Edward received a reply from Abaga, stating that he was eager to engage in joint operations against the Muslims. Next, more English troops arrived at Acre, under the command of Edward's younger brother, Edmund, famous for his prowess in battle. Hugh III, King of Cyprus, also showed up with his forces. His army swelled. Edward led a successful raid on the Mamluk-held town of Kakun, while the Mongols devastated the land around Aleppo. However, internal troubles within the Mongol state drew Abaga's attention away from Mamluk territory, and his troops withdrew. Baybars recognized the crucial role Cyprus had played in the defeat of his siege at Tripoli. Therefore, with the goal of destroying the Crusaders' supply lines, the Mamluk Sultan launched a surprise naval invasion of Cyprus, while Edward and the rest of the Christian army was still at Acre. The Mamluk ships attempted a night landing on the port before Limassol, but due to a combination of choppy waters and the crew's unfamiliarity with the port, all the vessels wrecked on the rocks. Some 1,800 Muslim troops were killed or captured by the Cypriots, and the ships plundered. Edward recognized that, considering the fewness of his troops and the enormity of the Mamluk power, further offensive actions were out of the question. He immediately sent a delegation to Baybars to begin negotiating a truce. The Sultan, eager to be rid of Edward and his troublesome crusade, was quite receptive. Edward's goal was to conclude a 10-year truce, settle the political squabbles between the Ibelins and Hugh III of Cyprus, then return to Europe to muster support for a large-scale crusade against the Mamluks. In May 1272, a treaty was struck at Caesarea, which specified the 10-year truce that Edward had wanted. Prince Edmund then departed for England, but Edward decided to stay to ensure that the treaty held and to continue settling the political situation inside the Crusader states. Within a month, Edward was attacked by an assassin who had managed to enter his bedchamber. The prince received a number of stab wounds, but was able to wrestle the man to the ground and kill him. Edward was confined to bed, formulated a concept of holy war, jihad, calling on Muslims to subjugate non-Muslims through warfare. Therefore, between AD 633 and 715, Arab armies conquered some two-thirds of the Christian world, including Mesopotamia, Syria, the Holy Land, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain. Through the 8th and 11th centuries, Christians and Muslims continued to fight each other. The Christians attempted to beat the Muslims back and reconquer territory that had been lost. Most of the fighting took place in border regions between the Christian and Muslim worlds, especially Spain, Italy, and what is now called Turkey, but was at the time a Christian region known as Anatolia, ruled by the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine Empire. In the 10th century, a warlike people known as the Seljuk Turks converted to Islam and took power in the Muslim world. The Byzantines were defeated by the Turks in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert, losing almost all of Anatolia. In 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus sent messengers to Pope Urban II in Rome, requesting military aid from the West. Pope Urban gave a speech at the Council of Clermont, where he called on the knights of Europe to unite and march east to help the Byzantines. Christians had fought wars against Muslims before, but Pope Urban declared that anyone who fought in this war would be partaking in a sacred act and win remission from guilt associated with sin, that is to say, earn an indulgence. Pope Urban also emphasized the sacredness of Jerusalem, where Christ had walked, died, and rose. The Pope taught that by purging Jerusalem of Muslim rulers, the Christians would be performing a holy act in God's eyes. Essentially, the Pope envisioned crusaders as a new type of pilgrim, warrior pilgrims. The tradition of pilgrimage to the holy places in the East had long been a staple of life for medieval Europeans. Therefore, when the Pope suggested to European knights that they should conquer the holy city of Jerusalem and capture it for their own rule, this resonated with them deeply. Huge numbers of knights and common people organized and set out for the East. Several great lords at the time combined their armies for this mission, including Godfrey Bouillon, Raymond IV of Toulouse, and Bohemond. This was the first crusade that ever occurred, and is now known as the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099. It was very successful, conquering and organizing several new Crusader states in Syria and Palestine. The most important of these states was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, with its capital in the holy city of Jerusalem. Over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, Christians would continue to fight crusades against the Muslims in the Holy Land, with Jerusalem changing hands several times. During this same period, the popes would call many crusades in Spain and Portugal against the Muslim occupiers in those regions. Gradually, the Crusaders drove the Muslims out of the whole of the Iberian Peninsula. Also, the popes sanctioned crusades in the Baltic against the pagan people who dwelt in those territories, the Northern Crusades. While the Crusades in Spain and the Baltic succeeded, the campaigns in the Holy Land eventually began to fail, with the Muslims driving the Crusaders out of Syria and Palestine completely in 1291. In the 14th century, the Ottoman Turks came to power in the Islamic world and eventually grew to be the greatest power in Islamic history, having driven the Christians out of the holy places and baggage. As a result, the light Turkish cavalry could no longer do them much damage. Suddenly, the armies of Raymond and Godfrey appeared and charged, crushing and scattering the Turks. The Crusaders now entered Syria and marched south. By October, they'd arrived before Antioch, the largest city in the Mediterranean world at that time, aside from Constantinople. Part of Antioch's walls hugged the treacherous Mount Silpius, and the sheer size of the city made it impossible for the army to fully surround it. Although they'd hoped to move on to Jerusalem in a few weeks, the Crusaders were detained by the siege through the winter, which brought hunger to the Latin camp. By the opening months of 1098, the Crusaders were no closer to entering Antioch, and desertions became rampant. Tatikios withdrew the Byzantine contingent, promising to return with reinforcements. By May, still no Byzantine army had arrived. But news reached the Crusaders that Kerboga, a powerful Turkish emir from Baghdad, was on his way with a massive army ready to crush the Christian besiegers. It was at this point that Bohemond, who spoke fluent Greek, established contact with an Armenian guard named Firuz. On one of the towers on Antioch's walls, Firuz agreed to betray his tower to Bohemond. On the night of June 2nd, Bohemond moved a force before Firuz's tower under cover of darkness. Quickly seizing control of that section of the wall, Bohemond threw open a city gate to the army. The Crusaders poured into Antioch, slaughtering Lower Lorraine, driven by his deep piety to rescue Jerusalem. Bohemond, a giant red-headed Norman, left southern Italy with a small but experienced force. The wealthiest man to take the cross was Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, richer than the King of France, and leader of a vast host of southern French knights. The Crusaders converged on Constantinople, where they swore an oath to Alexius Comnenus to return any lands they captured from the Muslims to his empire. In exchange, the Crusaders were to receive military and provisional support from the Byzantines. Accompanied by a small Byzantine detachment under the general Tatikios, the Crusaders crossed the Bosporus into Asia Minor, where, in 1097, they besieged Turkish-occupied Nicaea, the city from whence was born the famous creed of the Christian faith. After defeating a Turkish relief force led by Kili Arslan, the Crusaders attacked the city with mangonels and a siege tower built by Count Raymond. A month later, the Turks surrendered, and Byzantine flags flew once more over Nicaea's walls. The Crusaders continued eastward, across the desolate plains of Asia Minor, hampered by the brutal heat of the sun. Bohemond's army marched ahead of Godfrey's and Raymond's, and by July, the Norman host had reached the ruins of Dorylaeum. Suddenly, Kili Arslan, who had been tracking Bohemond, attacked the Normans with his swift Turkish mounted archers. At first, the Crusaders suffered serious losses, but Bohemond ordered his men to dismount and form a protective encirclement around their horseland. The Muslims conquered Constantinople and drove into Eastern Europe. During the early modern era, Crusades were no longer about conquering the Holy Land, but trying to stop the powerful Ottomans from conquering Europe. The popes called crusades against the Ottoman advance, but many failed. The Ottoman Empire continued to grow, swallowing Christian Greece, Crimea, Wallachia, Hungary, Moldavia, and threatening to capture Austria and Italy. Conversely, the Crusades in Spain continued to go well, with Queen Isabel and King Fernando destroying the last Islamic hold in Granada in 1492. In the late 16th century, the tide began to turn again. European powers formed holy leagues, sanctioned with papal crusades. The Ottomans were defeated by a holy league at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, and another holy league defeated the Ottomans decisively in 1683 at the Battle of Vienna, and 1697 at the Battle of Zenta. To recap, the era of crusading began in 1095 with the First Crusade, and continued roughly into the 17th century. A crusade had several defining characteristics, which distinguished it from another military expedition. 1. It was called by a pope. 2. Participants in a crusade earned an indulgence, remission of punishment associated with sins. And 3. A crusade was fought either to hold a sacred site or to expand or defend Christian borders. The First Crusade began to depart for the East in August 1096 with the blessing of Pope Urban II. Among the great lords marching at the heads of their armies was Godfrey of Bouillon, the powerful Duke of